In an age when kings across West Africa struck bargains of gold and muskets at the expense of their people, one ruler dared to speak a word rarely heard on the slave coast. No. Abdul Kader Kane, leader of Futa Toro in the late 18th century, stood at the crossroads of betrayal and dignity. French traders came with their ships, their contracts, their endless hunger for captives. They offered alliances, wealth, and weapons. They expected Kane, like so many rulers before him, to sign away his people in exchange for profit. But Kane refused. In words that cut sharper than any sword, he declared, "We do not traffic in our people." His refusal rang like thunder across Senegambia, a defiance that risked war, rebellion, and the wrath of foreign empires. While other kingdoms hollowed themselves out in chains, Futa Toro carved a moral line in the sand. Satire sharpens the irony. France, a nation that preached liberty in Europe, demanded chains in Africa. Traders toasted freedom in Paris while loading captives on ships along the Senegal River. Kane's stand exposed the hypocrisy not only of Europeans, but of African rulers who betrayed their kin for muskets. Tonight, we uncover the story of Senegambia's forgotten hero, the king who chose justice over gold, dignity over betrayal. A story that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, voices of conscience refuse to be silenced. Senegambia, the land of rivers, stretched from the Senegal to the Gambia, a mosaic of kingdoms, villages, and communities bound by trade, faith, and tradition. Caravans carried salt and gold across the savannas. Fishermen cast nets along the rivers. Markets thrived where desert met forest, a crossroads of civilizations. This was not a silent land waiting to be discovered. It was alive with voices: Wolof kingdoms, Fulani herders, Mandinka traders, Serer farmers. Each carried their own customs, their own elders, their own oaths sworn to ancestors. Unity was fragile, but dignity was constant. In the 18th century, this land stood under new pressures. European ships pressed along the coast, their flags snapping in the Atlantic winds. The French, entrenched at Saint Louis and Gorée, sought to extend their influence inland. Their hunger was not for ivory or pepper alone, it was for bodies. Satirical irony stained the air. In France, philosophers toasted liberty, equality, and fraternity. In Africa, French traders sharpened chains, polished muskets, and prepared dungeons. The Senegal River, once a lifeline of commerce, became a corridor of betrayal. Yet, amid this intrusion, the interior carried a pulse of resistance. Among the Fulani communities of Futa Toro, a reformist movement stirred. Scholars and imams called for a renewal of faith, a society guided by Islamic principles of justice. Out of this rising wave stepped a leader whose name would echo against the tide of betrayal: Abdul Kader Kane. Futa Toro lay along the banks of the Senegal River, a fertile stretch where farmers cultivated millet and rice and herders brought cattle to graze. It was a land blessed with water, yet cursed with proximity to French forts downstream. Every harvest could be shadowed by the sails of foreign ships. In the 18th century, Futa Toro became the heart of a Fulani-led reformist movement. Tired of corruption, of chiefs who taxed their people into poverty, of rulers who flirted with betrayal, the people turned to a new model of leadership. They sought justice in faith and dignity in unity. Out of this movement rose Abdul Kader Kane. He was not merely a warrior, nor just a scholar, but both. He carried the authority of the sword and the respect of the Quran. His voice drew strength from the people's hunger for justice, and his rule rested on a promise to defend his people, not sell them. The French saw Futa Toro as opportunity. Its location along the river meant access to the interior, to trade routes that stretched deep into the continent. They expected Kane, like other rulers, to yield to diplomacy, which in truth meant bargaining lives for muskets. But Kane's rise was different. He rejected the idea that people could be reduced to cargo. He believed that a ruler's duty was first to his subjects, not to foreign traders. His reign began with a moral oath: no inhabitant of Futa Toro would be handed to slavers. Satire sharpens the contrast. French traders raised glasses to liberty in Paris salons, while in Saint Louis they drafted contracts demanding captives. They saw Kane as naive, even foolish. But his foolishness was the wisdom of justice, a refusal to betray. Under his leadership, Futa Toro declared independence not only from rival states, but from the poison of the trade. It was a bold gamble. Wealth would be scarcer, weapons harder to acquire. But Kane wagered that dignity was worth more than muskets. Thus, the stage was set. A king who refused betrayal, facing a world addicted to it. Where other thrones glittered with coins bought in chains, his throne stood on the fragile but unbroken foundation of conscience. By the late 18th century, French ships crowded the mouth of the Senegal River. Their captains carried ledgers fat with names, cargo lists, and quotas. Each entry was not for goods, but for people. 100 captives here, 200 there, human beings turned into columns of arithmetic. From their base at St. Louis, French traders pushed upriver. They built alliances with petty chiefs, bribed middlemen, and promised wealth to those willing to deliver captives. They believed the river was theirs to command, and that every ruler along its banks would bow to their golden muskets. Satirical irony bloomed on French lips. In Paris, revolutionaries spoke of liberty, equality, fraternity. In Senegambia, their merchants spoke of contracts, quotas, and chains. The same nation that declared human rights in Europe declared human cargo in Africa. When the French emissaries reached Abdul Kader Kane, they expected another bargain. They brought gifts, muskets polished until they gleamed, barrels of liquor, bolts of cloth dyed in dazzling colors. They spoke of alliances, of civilization, of partnership. But beneath every word was the same demand: give us people. Kane's court listened in silence. His nobles shifted uneasily. To refuse would mean risk of losing trade, risk of angering the French, risk of war. To agree would mean betraying everything Futa Toro had sworn to defend. Then Kane rose. His voice, calm but sharp as steel, cut through the chamber. He told the French plainly, "We do not traffic in our people. We will not sell our sons and daughters to fill your ships." The words rang like thunder. They were simple, but they carried weight enough to defy an empire. Where other rulers had bent, Kane stood straight. Where others counted captives as profit, he counted dignity as priceless. The French emissaries were stunned. They laughed nervously, as if he misunderstood. They repeated their offers, stacked promises higher, glittered muskets in the light. But Kane did not waver. Each attempt only sharpened his refusal. Satire crackled in the air. The French, who had declared the rights of man, tried to explain why those rights did not apply along the Senegal. They cloaked greed in the language of progress, expecting Kane to nod along. Instead, he revealed their hypocrisy, holding up a mirror in which their pretenses melted. In that moment, Futa Toro became more than a small state on a riverbank. It became a beacon, a kingdom that drew a line where others erased theirs, a leader who proved that betrayal was not inevitable, that dignity could still roar in the face of cannons. Defiance always carries a price. For Kane, the refusal to sell his people was not just a bold statement, it was a challenge thrown into the teeth of French power. The merchants of St. Louis were not used to hearing no. They had built their fortunes on African kings who nodded, signed, and delivered. Kane's defiance struck them like a slap. The French answered in the only language they knew: pressure. They cut off supplies of muskets and powder. They tightened control of river trade, choking routes that had long linked Futa Toro to the coast. Caravans, once heavy with goods, now returned half empty. Satire wrote itself in these contradictions. France preached commerce, but punished those who refused to sell people. They preached freedom in Europe, but punished freedom in Africa. They proclaimed justice, but only when justice aligned with their ledgers. Inside Futa Toro, Kane's decision sparked debate. Some nobles worried, without muskets, how could the kingdom defend itself against enemies like Kayor or Bundu? Without trade, how could markets thrive? Betrayal looked tempting to those who measured survival in coins and weapons, but Kane stood firm. He argued that no throne was worth keeping if it was built on the broken backs of its own people. He invoked faith, reminding his court that selling kin was not only treachery, but a curse upon the land. To betray was to invite the wrath of both God and ancestors. Still, the cost was real. French-backed raiders probed Futa Toro's borders, testing its defenses. Rival chiefs, eager for profit, mocked Kane's policies. Villages near the river feared attack not only from outsiders, but from the merchants of Saint Louis, who sought captives by force when trade failed. The weight of leadership pressed heavy. Kane's reign was no golden festival of wealth. It was a long, hard struggle to balance dignity against survival. Each refusal of French demands meant another sacrifice. Each stand for justice meant another risk. And yet, even under pressure, his defiance grew into legend. Word spread across Senegambia. There was a king who refused to sell his people. Traders whispered it in markets, griots sang it in villages, imams repeated it in sermons. Kane's defiance became more than policy. It became identity. Satirical irony sharpened the legacy. France, a great empire with fleets and armies, was unsettled not by cannons, but by a sentence. We do not traffic in our people. Their merchants who once swaggered through courts with contracts now fumed in frustration at a ruler who valued conscience over gold. The price of defiance was heavy, but for Kane, the heavier price would have been betrayal. He chose to bear the weight of struggle rather than the shame of complicity. His throne might tremble, his kingdom might suffer, but his people would not be sold. The Senegal River became a line of confrontation, a place where two visions of the world collided. On one side, French merchants and their African allies treated human beings as cargo, measured by height, weight, and price. On the other stood Abdul Kader Kane, insisting that people were not commodities. French retaliation intensified. They sent emissaries laced with threats instead of promises. They armed Kane's rivals in neighboring states, hoping to squeeze Futa Toro from every border. Guns and powder flowed freely to those willing to sell captives. To those who refused, there was only isolation. Satirical irony glared in every act. French governors wrote letters boasting of spreading civilization, while their forts echoed with the cries of captives crammed into dungeons. They spoke of liberty, equality, and fraternity while arming warlords to enslave their neighbors. They preached progress but delivered chains. Inside Africa, Kane faced not only foreign merchants, but African rulers who embraced betrayal. Chiefs from Kayor and Bundu saw profit where Kane saw disgrace. They raided villages, traded captives, and mocked Kane's defiance as weakness. To them, he was a fool throwing away wealth. But Kane refused to bend. He denounced their actions as crimes against both faith and humanity. He declared that a ruler who betrayed his own people for muskets had already lost his crown. He warned that betrayal hollowed kingdoms from within, leaving only ruins behind. Clashes erupted along the borders. French-backed raiders struck settlements near the river. Kane's forces, lacking abundant muskets, relied on determination and unity. Villagers, armed with little more than spears and faith, resisted assaults meant to supply French ships. Each battle was unequal, but each refusal kept dignity alive. Satire sharpened further in these confrontations. European captains toasted their allies as honorable men, even as those allies dragged chained neighbors to the coast. They called Kane stubborn, yet praised warlords who burned villages for profit. Civilization was a word on their lips, hypocrisy the truth in their hands. Kane's defiance was costly, but it inspired. Griots sang of his courage, likening him to a lion who stood firm even when surrounded by hyenas. Children whispered his words, "We do not traffic in our people," as a mantra of pride. Futa Toro's fields bore scars of raids, but its spirit bore the fire of resistance. For the French, the clash was frustrating. They could break treaties, fuel wars, and burn villages, but they could not buy Kane. They could corrupt neighbors, but they could not twist his conscience. They had encountered not just an African king, but a wall of principle. The worlds clashed again and again. Greed against dignity, profit against justice, betrayal against conscience. And while the French carried more muskets, Kane carried something they could not understand, the stubborn, unshakable refusal to reduce people to cargo. Defiance came at a cost beyond the battlefield. As Kane held firm to his vow, Futa Toro began to feel the tightening grip of isolation. The French, angered by his refusal, sought to strangle his economy. Muskets grew scarce, cloth rarer, salt dearer. Markets that once thrived along the river now stuttered under the weight of blockade. Villagers grumbled quietly. Farmers who once traded surpluses found their goods piling unsold. Craftsmen who once bartered for cloth now patched rags. Parents who once felt pride in their land now feared hunger. For some, Kane's defiance looked like stubbornness paid for with their suffering. Satirical irony thickened the air. France, draped in the rhetoric of liberty, chose starvation as punishment for a people who demanded freedom. Their governors wrote of civilized order, while instructing traders to cut supplies until villages bent under want. Their merchants complained of Kane's cruelty while tightening the screws of embargo. Inside Futa Toro, Kane stood between the weight of principle and the cries of his people. His council debated bitterly. Some urged compromise. Perhaps a few captives could be sold to buy peace, to buy muskets, to buy survival. Others stood firm beside Kane, warning that a single betrayal would poison the whole land. Kane chose to endure. He reminded his people that dignity carried a price, but so did betrayal, a heavier one, paid in shame and in chains. He invoked faith, declaring that God would not bless a throne built on selling kin. His sermons carried both hope and stern warning. Better hunger than dishonor. Still, hunger gnawed at loyalty. Some chiefs whispered in secret with French agents. Some villages eyed the wealth of their neighbors and wondered if betrayal could buy relief. Each hardship made Kane's refusal harder to sustain. Each season of scarcity a test of conscience. Satire sharpened in contrast. Rival rulers who trafficked captives flourished with French muskets, their courts gleaming with foreign cloth. They mocked Futa Toro as backward, impoverished, foolish. Yet beneath their glitter, their people whispered of curses and dishonor. They ate well, but slept uneasily. Kane bore the weight of isolation not as a moment, but as a season that stretched into years. His throne did not shine with coins or foreign gifts. It stood instead with the burden of resistance, battered by pressure yet unbroken. In his hardship, Futa Toro became a land of trial, a furnace where dignity was tested. The world outside judged him harshly. French captains called him impractical. Rival chiefs called him weak. Even some of his own subjects doubted him. But history, looking back, saw something different. In the cracks of suffering, Kane's defiance gleamed brighter than gold. The French grew tired of Kane's defiance. To them, diplomacy had failed. Patience, they believed, was wasted on a ruler who refused reason defined as profit in captives. Their answer was retaliation, sharpened with muskets and fueled by greed. From their fort at St. Louis, they dispatched expeditions upriver. Traders became raiders, soldiers masqueraded as allies. Where contracts failed, cannon fire spoke. Villages near the river bore the brunt, burned for the crime of belonging to a kingdom that said no. Satirical irony twisted every act. France, champion of liberty in Europe, sent fleets to terrorize Africans who dared to demand liberty at home. They celebrated rights in Paris while torching huts along the Senegal. They raised the banner of progress while dragging chains behind them. Kane refused to bow. His forces, poorly armed compared to French-backed rivals, fought with courage born of conviction. Farmers laid aside hoes to carry spears. Imams blessed warriors with prayers instead of powder. Each battle was uneven, yet each defense carried the force of dignity. The French found allies among Kane's enemies. Chiefs from Bundu, Cayor, and other states joined the assault, enticed with muskets and coin. They saw Kane's refusal as a weakness to exploit. In their courts, betrayal wore the crown, while Kane wore isolation like armor. Clashes erupted along the river. French raiders ambushed caravans hoping to destabilize the flow of goods. Kane's men struck back with ambushes of their own, using terrain and courage to balance the lack of muskets. The Senegal, once a river of trade, churned with smoke and blood. Satire sharpened further. French officials complained of Kane's barbarity for refusing slavery while praising allies who sold their neighbors by the hundreds. They condemned his stubbornness while applauding treachery. Civilization was their mask, hypocrisy was their face. For the people of Futa Toro, the storm was relentless. Homes were burned, harvests disrupted, families uprooted. Yet Kane's vow still held: no son or daughter of Futa Toro would be sold. His defiance, battered and bloodied, still stood. To France, Kane was a nuisance to be broken. To his people, he became a shield, imperfect, fragile, but standing where others had fallen. In his resistance, the storm revealed its truth. Empire could destroy villages, but it could not purchase dignity. Though Kane's reign was scarred by hardship, his defiance carved a moral line in history. In a region where betrayal had become common currency, he declared that justice was worth more than muskets. His words outlived his struggles. "We do not traffic in our people." Oral tradition carried his story. Griots sang of the ruler who stood against empires. Villages repeated his vow as a proverb of dignity. Even in exile or poverty, his people remembered that their ruler had chosen honor over gold, conscience over betrayal. Satirical irony deepens in memory. Other kings of the era are remembered for palaces, for armies, for fleeting triumphs that ended in ruin. Kane is remembered for saying no. What others saw as weakness became his immortality. French records, though written with contempt, preserved the shock of his refusal. Merchants complained of his stubbornness, governors raged at his audacity, soldiers cursed his resistance. Unwittingly, they testified to his strength. One man had shaken an empire with a sentence. His defiance inspired beyond his borders. Neighboring communities whispered his name when deciding whether to sell or resist. Later generations of Fulani reformers saw in Kane an example of how leadership could be tied to principle, not profit. His courage became part of a lineage of resistance. The contrast with betrayal is stark. Where kingdoms that trafficked their own people crumbled into dust, Kane's story grew brighter with time. His land may have suffered isolation, but his memory carried dignity. History remembers not the wealth of his rivals, but the conscience of his throne. Legacy is not measured in gold, but in truth. Kane's defiance proves that even one voice standing against chains can echo across centuries. His courage reminds us that justice endures even when surrounded by greed. If Abdul Kader Kane's defiance was so bold, why is his name absent from most history books? The answer lies not in his weakness, but in the priorities of those who wrote history. Empires rarely preserve the memory of those who opposed them. French archives documented contracts, cargo lists, and profits. They praised chiefs who cooperated, recorded treaties with rulers who delivered captives, and celebrated forts that stood as monuments to betrayal. But a ruler who refused their terms was dismissed as irrelevant. Satirical irony sharpens the erasure. France immortalized its ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, yet erased a man who embodied liberty in Africa more clearly than many in Europe. They celebrated Parisian revolutionaries while silencing African voices who lived those ideals under fire. Colonial narratives compounded the silence. Later, European historians painted Africa as complicit, suggesting slavery was embraced by all. Stories like Kane's contradicted that myth, proving that resistance was real and betrayal was a choice, not destiny. So his story was pushed into the margins. Even within Africa, betrayal often overshadowed resistance. Palaces built on slave wealth left ruins to study. Wars fought for captives filled chronicles. Kane's refusal, quiet yet unyielding, survived more in oral tradition than in official records. His legacy lived in griot's songs, not European ink. The forgetting was deliberate. To admit Kane's defiance would mean admitting that not all African rulers were complicit, and that colonial powers sought to crush not only bodies, but conscience itself. Remembering him exposes hypocrisy, and hypocrisy prefers silence. Yet, silence is never absolute. Oral histories whispered his name across generations. Local memory preserved what archives ignored. And today, by speaking his story, we reclaim a chapter torn out by those who feared its truth. The story of Abdul Kader Kane is more than a tale of one king in Senegambia. It is a mirror reflecting what power becomes when it chooses betrayal and what dignity becomes when it chooses justice. His defiance turns history from tragedy into testimony. While French traders sharpened chains and rival chiefs traded kin for muskets, Kane said no. He stood in a world addicted to betrayal and proved that another choice existed. His refusal exposed not only the greed of empires, but also the hypocrisy of liberty preached abroad and denied in Africa. Satirical irony still burns today. Nations that celebrate freedom monuments forget the man who defended freedom without cannons or fleets. History books glorify conquerors while ignoring the one who conquered greed. Kane's silence in those pages is itself a judgment against them. His defiance reminds us that history is not destiny. Betrayal was widespread, but it was never inevitable. Resistance was real, conscience endured, and justice had its champions. Kane's throne may have lacked gold, but it carried a wealth that outlasts empires. Integrity. Across centuries, his vow echoes, "We do not traffic in our people." It was not just a refusal, it was a declaration of humanity, a moral boundary stronger than fort walls. That vow belongs not only to Senegambia, but to the world. Today, remembering him is an act of justice. It restores dignity to those silenced, shatters myths of complicity, and honors the courage of a man who chose righteousness over survival. To forget Kane is to let hypocrisy win. To remember him is to let truth endure. Forgotten history is not forgotten justice. By recalling Abdul Kader Kane's defiance, we remind ourselves that conscience matters more than gold, that justice outweighs betrayal, and that even one voice can change the course of memory. His legacy asks us, when greed tempts, whose side will we stand on?